Web of Conspiracy. Here is your host, Adam Webb.
Hello, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Web of Conspiracy. I am your host, Adam Webb. It's great to be back with you this week. It's been a while. Been a little busy, a little unfortunately held up, not being able to get to doing the podcast as much as I would like. So I apologize for the delays. I know a number of you have sent some emails, and I appreciate all of your support. And going forward, I think I'm probably going to have some difficulty in terms of being able to continue to do this weekly. That's still my goal, but realistically, I'm probably looking at maybe every 2 weeks kind of basis at this point. Unfortunately, it's been nearly a month since I released a new podcast, so my apologies for those of you who have been listening to me for a long time. Certainly not my expectation to have gone this long. Now, that being said, I am doing some other projects, some other things I'm working on. But one thing in particular, and I guess I am curious about getting some feedback from some of the listeners. For those of you who've been listening to the show now for over a year, pushing about a year and a half now, know that my background is in public policy and some of these other things that I do, and I've certainly touched on a lot of the foreign policy issues and some of the things like that. I've actually kicked around an idea of creating one of these pseudo works of fiction, but not exactly. Bear with me here. I'm in the process of putting together what you would, I guess, call a contingency plan in the event of what if we were dealing with an invasion of an extraterrestrial species of some kind. Now, before everybody jumps on this and says, oh, well, that's been done and overdone in movies and things like that, not in the way that I have any intention or desire to produce. I want to look at this in terms of pure policy, pure strategy, and I want to look at every single base. And when I say that, I mean, what are the contingency plans for the various different possibilities of extraterrestrial life? Okay, that is sort of the goal here. What is our plan if we deal with entities that are perhaps friendly? What is the approach and the plan for dealing with those who may be very aggressive? And of course, anywhere in between. And also, varying levels of intelligence. We operate under the assumption that any entity that would have the ability to get here would be of greater intelligence than us. And that is possibly true. However, there may be other aspects of intelligence that those entities may lack that perhaps are a greater strength to us. So I'm really looking to explore the possibility of putting together, from a policy perspective, what do organizations, agencies, government bodies, how do they actually respond in the event of a legitimate threat? Do they respond in the ways that you would expect in a Independence Day or a War of the Worlds? Or what would an actual response look like? That is my goal. My idea in doing this is to really try to develop something that is something that would be a little more realistic. So that's been something that I've been working towards and working on at the moment, and I would like to get some feedback from those of you who have been interested in that kind of thing. Let me know if it's something that you'd be interested in reading. I'd love to get the feedback from you on that. That has certainly taken up a little bit more of my time as well. So that being said, do want to touch on a couple of topics real quick here. There has been, this is just something I have noticed in a number of the UFO reporting agencies and other things that I examine regularly. There's been a significant uptick in UFO activity. I find that interesting. Perhaps a number of different reasons for that. But if by any chance you've happened to notice any kind of strange objects, unidentifiable, truly unidentifiable, not necessarily misjudging from a drone or an aircraft or the International Space Station, something along those lines, I'd like to get your feedback and get to gather a little bit of information about your sighting. There seems to be quite an uptick. I know there was in Britain a couple weeks back. There seemed to be a little burst. There's been some reports even in the States as well. There seems to be a little bit of a spike in UFO activity. So I'm curious as to what that may actually be. And so I'd like to get some information from any of you who perhaps may have witnessed any of that. Today's topic is something that I had mentioned, on the last podcast that this was something that I wanted to touch upon, and this podcast is going to be a little briefer. I don't want to go too crazy in depth. I have gotten some feedback from those who appreciate the brevity in the presentation, so I'm working towards being a little more brief, but yet to the point with some of the topics. So for today, I really wanted to spend time and do a show on Thunderbirds. Now, many of you will be familiar with that, whether it be from the old Ford Thunderbird motor vehicle, or for those of you who know anything about Native American lore, mythology, and history, you'll know that the Thunderbird is certainly a key part in that. Now, for many, that's where the Thunderbird story ends. It ends with it being just something from mythology, stories and legends that were passed as a way of explaining thunderstorms and things of that nature. However, there are other reports and other stories of Thunderbirds that truly resemble not just birds, but descriptions of a thundering sound that came from their wings as they flew overhead. Needless to say, some fascinating stories have emerged out of that lore. And the sightings, as I said, you go back, hundreds of years, but they're not just relegated to North America. Many other cultures, I know Japan and in Europe, have stories, and I think even some African nations as well, have stories dedicated to the idea of these huge winged bird-like creatures that some describe as being bird men, others describe as just being huge bird-like creatures, much bigger than anything they've ever seen. So there is a consistency in the traditions of many peoples throughout the globe. And for those of you who've listened to the show, you know that for me, that is something significant. I look at, as my original training as a historian, I don't dismiss any of this entirely. I think it's important that we try to understand the context. I think it's important that we try to look at it from different perspectives. And all too often we look at things from one perspective. These are just legends to explain natural phenomena. And while that may very well still be the case in many of these instances, what I find most intriguing is that this is a consistent story that's told. Now, this could mean that these are actual creatures that people are seeing throughout the world, and have remarkably similar stories. Or this tradition has somehow managed to survive multiple cultures for thousands and thousands and thousands, perhaps even longer years, depending on when you believe the origin of the earth and the origin of mankind developed and how it developed. So, we have these stories. What do we make of this? Well, what I find most intriguing is that these legends, they didn't just suddenly fade out in the 20th and even the 21st centuries. This legend, for many, still continues. And stories and sightings of the Thunderbird date into the late 19th century, early 20th century, and even some stories in the early 2000s about people witnessing these huge birds, bigger than anything they've ever seen before. Now, one intriguing story, at least one of the more intriguing stories in my experience in researching this, is one from 1977. A 10-year-old boy named Marlon Lowe, he was outside playing with his friends, and he described a large bird that had swooped down, picked him up about a foot in the air, picked him up by his shirt, and had a hold of him, had lifted him off. Now, many of you who have small animals know that this is certainly a concern when you're talking about other birds of prey. Many stories from people I know who, if they have a lot of these smaller toy dogs that have stories of hawks and other birds of prey that have come down and grabbed their pets. So this isn't entirely unusual to hear this happening to small animals. However, it is certainly a little unusual to hear about it happening to a child. And he was 10 years old, so we're not talking about an infant. We're talking about a fairly good-sized young boy. At the time, Marlin weighed 60 pounds. So the bird that would have had to have done this, the animal that would have had to have done this, would have been significantly strong to be able to even lift him for as long as it did. Granted, it didn't get incredibly high, but nevertheless, it still did pick him up. Now, these stories like this are present throughout. There was even a story in Alaska of a very similar type of bird that many described as Birdzilla that reached huge. It was flying almost as high as the plane, as a pilot had seen this and reported this. Now, what are these birds? Well, it would appear as one of the more mainstream explanations. Certainly, as in the case of both of these, it is believed that the California condor is perhaps the greatest explanation for what is happening here. That now this condor has an incredibly long wingspan, longer than anything else, at least known, at approximately. I think many reports of it having around a 14-foot wingspan, something along those lines. So they are very large birds of prey. And the description seemed to fit in both of those scenarios in 1977 and the sighting by the pilot in the airplane in 2002 in Alaska seemed to reflect a possibility that this is a California condor. And that is certainly the mainstream explanation for most of what is believed to be Thunderbirds. Many scientists believe that this is what was being seen. However, there are other theories that also possibly explain the legend of the Thunderbird, including some pictures that surfaced depicting was referred to as a Thunderbird by people who had managed to hunt these down. And these pictures are believed to be from the late 1800s, early 1900s. I know one of these photos completely disappeared altogether, but claimed to have demonstrated a group of hunters who captured and killed a Thunderbird that has a striking similarity to what you would best describe perhaps as looking like a pterodactyl, from the days of the dinosaurs. So what if, now there's plenty of reason to be skeptical of these photos. The veracity cannot be determined. We don't know if they've been faked. So there's a lot of mystery here. But there are many people who claim to have seen these type of Thunderbirds. Now, the condors are big, mind you, but the difference between a condor and a pterodactyl, well, there certainly is a visual difference. So that being said, for those who believe that what they see, it could very well be a pterodactyl in terms of some of these descriptions. Now, if that's the case, then perhaps we're looking at a prehistoric creature that has managed to survive in some way. Now, I have to admit, I'm fairly skeptical of that. But that being said, as I have been more than open to other possibilities, certainly of other wildlife, it is important to realize we are discovering new species daily. And yes, it is hard to imagine that something that big, that kind of a wingspan, would go unnoticed. With the California condors' wingspans being, on average about close to 9 feet, it'd be hard to miss something with a 14-foot or greater wingspan. But perhaps it does. I mean, perhaps something is out there that we have just missed, that has managed to stay relatively in secluded areas, mountainous ranges where fewer people are. The possibility does exist. So that is one, at least alternative explanation to perhaps what is going on with the Thunderbird phenomenon. There are those who argue that no, it's not someone mistaking a condor. This is a prehistoric relic that has managed to survive, much in the way that it is believed that now, previously believed extinction events for species in the oceans, by all means. We're finding tons of evidence to support that lots of prehistoric sea life still exists. So maybe, just maybe, some of this other land life still lingers on in more remote regions. Now, perhaps to me, one of the most intriguing theories is something that has managed to have been tied in to extraterrestrial phenomena. Now, I spent a lot of time talking about extraterrestrial phenomena on the show. I've made no doubt that I'm fascinated by the possibility. That being said, this is one that I had never really viewed this topic in this kind of vein before. But there are many who argue that what these native peoples described as being birdmen, these large bird-like creatures, or thunderbirds, were the best way that they could describe a UFO, a flying extraterrestrial craft. Now, I find that somewhat interesting because if you think about it, some of these descriptions of that it would make a thundering noise as it flew over their heads, in some of these descriptions of these Thunderbirds, and you have to wonder, well, no different than a plane flying over our heads now, creating a sonic boom. Can you imagine if you did not have the proper frame of reference to determine what it is you're seeing, what you would describe it as? Much in the way of the cargo cults that emerged in post-World War II era in the Pacific Islands, where these people created effigies of airplanes because they worshipped them as their gods, because the United States was dropping relief aid to these islands in the Pacific during the World War II, and certainly during the conflict with Japan in the Pacific front. So, to think in that perspective, that perhaps we're looking at people who were trying to describe what they were witnessing in a frame of reference they could understand. So, just maybe, in describing these as being large, thundering birds, what they were actually seeing were large flying craft. And that would certainly lend a little bit more credence to the possibility of this ancient astronaut theory that is so popular on TV these days, is this idea that perhaps we have been visited for a long time by extraterrestrial life forms, and our ancestors just were not able to properly give a true frame of reference for what they were seeing. They were explaining it in their best terms. It's an interesting theory. Certainly one that got my attention, one I had never considered before. But you have to kind of pause to think to yourself, is that out of the question? Sometimes the simplest answer is most times the simplest answer is the correct one. So yes, I would imagine that in many of these cases, we're seeing a misidentified bird. Perhaps we really are seeing the California condor. And areas where the condor is not native, well, then I think you have a number of other questions to ask. Perhaps there is a prehistoric relic still alive in remote regions. Or perhaps our ancestors were seeing aircraft they could not explain. They would describe these things as, thundering noise. And yes, some birds making, you hear some of the noise from their wingspan, and it can be loud, but there's loud and then there's thundering loud, and that is a distinct difference. So I cannot help but think to myself, what if the Thunderbird legend is somehow tied into extraterrestrial visitation? And I have to say, I'm always a bit skeptical when I get into connecting extraterrestrial theory into a lot of these stories, because I feel like the ancient astronaut theory is really trying to jump all over everything else. But that being said, I have always believed that many things that are of the mysterious and the unknown are connected. Just as many people, report lots of different types of anomalous activities in certain areas. How do you explain that? Well, I don't know. So, that being said, is the idea that perhaps extraterrestrial craft were mistaken by native peoples or developed into part of this Thunderbird lore that they had. It's a possibility. It's something that I would not be able to completely dismiss out of hand. Because what we don't have, truly don't have, is any kind of evidence to speak to anything other than what we have already determined. The evidence would indicate that perhaps this is just mythology, that perhaps these were just large birds of prey that are naturally existing still in our world. And I would think that for many who've had a small pet taken by a bird of prey, by hawks, by vultures, it wouldn't surprise you at all to imagine that perhaps a very large bird of prey would take a child. There are stories of that in many places. So the question remains, what is it most likely to be? What is the Thunderbird? Well, ultimately, I leave that for all the listeners to decide. Because, to me, it would seem that perhaps this is just a creature of mythology that's been misidentified, and that many of these cases could be determined to be just large birds of prey, like the condor. However, can I completely rule out that native peoples were witnessing aircraft they could not describe? The ancient astronaut theory does a tremendous job of presenting a lot of relics that appear to take on the semblance of things that we recognize in our current modern world. And sometimes that can be a little misguided. We can more or less see through our own lens as well. And that's important that we keep that in mind. It's hard to view a culture's past through their lens, just as it is from a culture now trying to view the past from the perspective of somebody 150 years from now. There's a significant gap in the way that both those cultures view the world. So maybe we read too much into this. And certainly the skeptics of ancient astronaut theory would argue that. We read far too into any of this stuff. It just happens to look that way. That's the way we see it. So that's what we see. But it is very hard in many of these occasions to look over some of these relics and think to yourself, how does that not look like an airplane, a spacecraft, an astronaut, an extraterrestrial, whatever the case may be, when we look at some of this artwork, when we look at some of these depictions. So yes, can I completely dismiss the possibility that these Thunderbird were, in fact, perhaps some sort of extraterrestrial craft? That was how indigenous peoples were describing what they were seeing because they just could not explain it any other way? Well, that would seem to be a distinct possibility. As for my personal opinion, I don't know. I have never witnessed a Thunderbird. I certainly can't attest to it. I know there are many who do claim that they have, and I would love to get some feedback. If any of you out there that listen to the show at any point, if you have in fact seen something that you believe might be the Thunderbird of legend or lore, I would love to hear from you. Shoot me an email, webofconspiracy@gmail.com. That's 2 B's in the web. Or send me a message on Facebook or Twitter. I would love to hear some first-hand witness testimony from people who truly believe that they have seen a Thunderbird, as the indigenous peoples describe. I would love to get some feedback on that. As I say, I tend to think that many of those can be naturally explained. However, perhaps there were a few that maybe were some sort of extraterrestrial craft, and indigenous peoples described these as Thunderbirds because they already had a paradigm. They already had a model of this is what a Thunderbird is. Or maybe the model was derived directly from these aircraft, and that presents a whole other different ball of wax to deal with. Well, that's what I have for you today. Once again, I apologize for the delays. I know that I have every intention of certainly producing a little bit more than I have been. Once again, I do apologize for that. And hopefully I'll be back with you here in a couple more weeks with an all-new episode. Until then, have a good one.